There are moments so brief that people believe history won't even have time to change its color. But sometimes, a single aircraft cutting through the calm sky of a Sahelian morning is enough to shake an entire continent. 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds for an unfamiliar signal to appear on Burkina Faso's radar screens. And just 10 seconds for the entire AES air defense system to shift from alert mode to live fire readiness. In that fleeting instant, Africa stood before a question greater than any border. Who truly controls our skies? Who decides our future? And why would a country like Nigeria, long seen as the region's big brother, allow a C-130 carrying 11 soldiers to fly straight into Burkina Faso's airspace without a single word of permission? Some may call it a technical malfunction, a navigation error, an emergency landing, but never in modern West African history had a small nation, freshly freed from decades of dependency, calmly ordered a regional power to stop immediately. Never before had three countries once defined by poverty and conflict simultaneously placed their air defenses on maximum alert and openly declared that any violation of their airspace would be shot down without warning. What is truly unfolding in this dry land between the sands of the Sahara? Why has Africa's long silence suddenly been torn apart by an act so firm that it startled the entire world? And where do young leaders like Ibrahim Traoré stand in this bold turning point? This is not just a story about an airplane. This is the moment a continent is forced to ask itself where the dignity of a people truly begins. If you are listening to this now, prepare yourself, because what happens next will not only change Burkina Faso's position, but open a new door for Africa's future. Hold your breath. History is walking into the room, and it is not knocking. Before Nigeria's C-130 was forced to land in Bobo Dioulasso, even before AES placed its air defenses on shoot-down readiness, another fire had already been smoldering beneath the scorching sands of the Sahara. It did not appear on radar screens. It made no sound, yet its destructive power surpassed any surface-to-air missile. It was the fire of accumulated resentment, of long years of interference, of voices yearning for autonomy but crushed under power structures Africa never chose for itself. Days before the airspace violation, Benin was shaken when a group of soldiers, their voices trembling but resolute, announced the dissolution of the government live on television. Just 2 hours later, according to multiple regional sources, Nigeria immediately deployed fighter jets, launching precise strikes on positions they claimed were linked to the uprising. A reaction so fast it defied belief. A response that made even seasoned West African political observers pause. Why could Nigeria, a country struggling for years with conflict and terrorism within its own borders, respond with such speed and accuracy within hours? And more importantly, who were they doing it for? Because behind the diplomatic masks of the region, the whispers have grown louder. France fears losing its last remaining influence in the Sahel after being expelled by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. An unstable Benin would mean Paris losing yet another foothold. And Nigeria, as the region's dominant power, suddenly became the most convenient card to restore an order France seeks to preserve. This is not an accusation. It is the logic of power. When interests are threatened, great powers always look for ways to regain control, often through hands the world struggles to see. Meanwhile, AES has chosen a different path. After decades of resource extraction, imposed security models that failed, and treatment as auxiliary zones of global strategy, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso began investing fully in building real sovereignty. They cut old treaties, expelled foreign troops, rebuilt their own militaries. This was not rebellion. It was maturity, a declaration that they would no longer allow others to define what stability or chaos means on their land. But when a new alliance rises with a clear spirit of self-determination, the old world does not stand still. Every move by AES is watched, analyzed, and at times deliberately obstructed. So when a Nigerian aircraft suddenly appeared in Burkina Faso's airspace without notification, it was not merely an aviation incident. It was a spark ignited by a fire that had been burning for years. A fire born from the struggle between nations reclaiming dignity and forces unwilling to surrender control. From that moment on, the Sahel was no longer silent. It became a grand arena where Africa's past and future collide with full force. When the C-130 signal appeared on Burkina Faso's air traffic monitoring system, no one in the command center realized they were witnessing the opening of a new chapter in West African history. This was not the first time a Nigerian military aircraft had flown near the border. But this time, something was wrong. The flight path did not match standard routes. Communication signals went unanswered. Most importantly, no permission had been requested to enter Burkina Faso's airspace. For a nation that had sworn to defend every inch of its sky at any cost. This was no accident. It was a clear violation of sovereignty. The order came swiftly and decisively. AES air defense systems were activated. Burkina Faso's fighter jets took off following interception protocol. There was no shouting, no panic, only the cold silence of soldiers who knew they were standing on the line between war and peace. The C-130 was forced to land at Bobo Dioulasso. 11 Nigerian soldiers stepped down under tight security. A scene that stunned the entire region because it had never happened before between two major West African states. Shortly after, AES, led by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, released a statement with no room for ambiguity. They confirmed that the C-130 had entered their airspace without authorization. They called it a violation of international law and member state sovereignty. They placed all air defense forces on maximum alert. And most importantly, they declared that any future violation would be shot down. A warning unprecedented in contemporary West African politics. Nigeria claimed the aircraft suffered a technical malfunction and was forced to make an emergency landing. AES rejected the explanation. If it was a malfunction, why no notification? If it was an error, why did it occur precisely when Benin was destabilized? And if there was no intent, why carry a full military unit instead of aid supplies or training equipment? These questions received no transparent answers. In this context, the figure of Ibrahim Traoré emerged more clearly than ever. He represents a new generation of AES leadership that no longer accepts half measures in diplomacy. Traoré has said that sovereignty is not an academic concept, but something defended through action. And this action proved that Burkina Faso has changed. No more silence under violation. No more diplomatic notes alone. Burkina Faso now responds with capability, clarity, and an unbowed spirit. To some, the C-130 incident may seem like an aviation mishap. But to those who understand the deeper struggle in the Sahel, it signals a new era. An era in which nations once considered weak now dare to draw their own red lines. An era in which anyone testing those boundaries must think carefully before taking another step. There are wars without gunfire, without craters, yet their damage lasts generations. In West Africa today, such a war is unfolding quietly but fiercely. A war not over territory or population, but over the right to decide the future of an entire region. The C-130 incident is only the surface. Beneath it lies a web of economic interests, military influence, and power models long treating West Africa as their default playground. For decades, France maintained near total dominance through military treaties, economic networks, and peacekeeping forces. When Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso expelled France, the power board shifted instantly. The collapse of the old model forced major powers to scramble for new channels of influence. Nigeria, with the region's largest economy and military, became the central piece many sought to leverage to restore a favorable order. At the same time, West Africa itself split along clear lines. On one side, ECOWAS leaned toward imported security frameworks. On the other, AES rejected all forms of intervention. This is not a policy disagreement. It is a clash of visions for Africa's existence. One vision sees external support as essential to stability. The other believes such support always comes at a price, one heavier and longer lasting than any short-term gain. In this silent battlefield, every AES decision is framed as disruption. Every ECOWAS move is questioned by sovereignty advocates as serving external interests more than regional ones. And between these forces, the C-130 incident struck hard, not because it was militarily dangerous, but because it exposed a power struggle no longer hidden. When the aircraft landed in Bobo Dioulasso, the question was no longer why it strayed. The question became who benefits from rising tension. Because every crisis creates opportunity. One side can justify deeper military presence. The other can strengthen the argument for independence. AES understands the danger better than anyone. They see signals beyond Nigeria's control. The Benin events, rapid deployments, and external political pressure form a logic suggesting certain forces want to push Nigeria and AES toward confrontation. In that context, forcing the C-130 to land was not just defense. It was a reminder that the rules have changed. No more silent nations allowing others to define security. No more lands treated as foreign testing grounds. This is a new West Africa, where even quiet steps can fracture a decaying old order. Amid the desert winds sweeping the harsh Sahel landscape, a young figure stands firm as a new marker in African history. Ibrahim Traoré did not emerge from elite universities or traditional power corridors. He rose from the ranks of soldiers, from the reality of a nation scarred by violence, poverty, and endless interference that robbed people of their sense of choice. From that hardship grew resistance and a hunger to restore national dignity, transforming him into a symbol of a new era. When Traoré took power, many believed he was merely a temporary figure in chaos, a young face easily influenced, a placeholder. The Sahel has seen such misjudgments before. Traoré proved not only capable of governing, but capable of surprising the world. Burkina Faso would no longer accept a secondary role in great power games. It would speak to the world in its own voice, unfiltered. This spirit shines brightest in his approach to regional security. Traoré rejected imported security models that failed for decades. He confronted a truth previous leaders avoided. No one cares more about Burkina Faso's stability than its people. No force understands the forests, valleys, and paths of the Sahel better than those raised there. So he made decisions outsiders call bold. Ending old military treaties, expelling ineffective foreign forces, restructuring the army, relying on internal strength to confront chaos. The C-130 airspace violation tested this philosophy. Many weaker nations would have accepted Nigeria's explanation and moved on. But for Traoré, sovereignty is non-negotiable, and it must be defended with real action, not diplomatic words. Forcing the aircraft to land was more than security. It was a declaration to the world that Africa's era of silent submission has ended. That the Sahel now stands with ownership, conviction, and the will to defend it. What makes Traoré truly different is not only decisiveness. It is his courage to imagine a different Africa. An Africa no longer confined to images of poverty and instability. An Africa standing on its own feet, defining its goals, building its path. His boldness unsettles old powers. But it gives ordinary people something they lost long ago: hope. And once hope is awakened, no force can easily put it out. Traoré knows that, and he is turning Burkina Faso into a torch, lighting the way for an entire continent that has been struggling to find itself again. There are times when the fate of a whole continent is placed on a scale by an action that seems small. The moment Nigeria's C-130 was intercepted in Burkina Faso was exactly that kind of moment. Not because one military aircraft can redraw the political map, but because that event exposed a question Africa has avoided for far too long. Which path will we choose? Unity and self-determination, or getting pulled back into conflicts that were never truly ours? Right after AES declared its air defenses ready to shoot down any violating target, the air in the region seemed to freeze. International analysts immediately warned of escalation. On one side stood Nigeria, the largest West African power in population and economy. On the other stood AES, with a level of firmness the region had never seen. If these two forces collide, it will no longer be a diplomatic incident. It will become the starting point of a regional crisis whose impact could spread far beyond the borders of the Sahel. The danger here is not the military strength of either side. The danger is the hidden hands waiting in the shadows. African history has proven that whenever internal cracks appear, someone from outside is always ready to fill that space with interests that never lean toward African people. A conflict between Nigeria and AES would open the door for the return of old security models. For treaties many nations believed they had escaped forever. Chaos would become the perfect excuse for foreign powers to rebuild the influence they have lost. That is why AES's decision is not only a hard statement. It is a warning bell. They understand who benefits when the continent is divided. They understand that a confrontation between nations sharing the same history and the same deep wounds only pushes Africa back to the starting line. And they understand that silence in the face of violated sovereignty would make every effort toward self-rule in recent years meaningless. On the other side, Nigeria faces its own choice. As the region's largest country, Nigeria carries responsibility for shaping West African stability. But because of that strength, it can also become a tool for forces that want to use it to suppress AES's rise. When the C-130 was forced to land, the question was not only why it entered Burkina Faso's sky, but whether Nigeria is acting for Nigeria's interests, or for the interests of those who whisper into its ear. In this blurry space, the next move belongs less to weapons and more to political wisdom across the region. A direct confrontation would only trap Africa in the same tragedy its ancestors endured for centuries. But if this moment is overcome with clarity, with dialogue, with a commitment to place the continent's interests first, Africa can turn a new page. A page not controlled by maps drawn from far away, but written by the people who live on this land. This is the true climax of the era. Africa stands at a crossroads. One path is division that turns every effort toward independence into ashes. The other path is a future where unity becomes the strongest weapon of all. And that choice does not belong only to leaders. It belongs to an awakening people. To those who understand that only by standing together can they step out from history's long shadow. Amid the unrest that has not yet settled after the C-130 incident, a new awareness is forming in the minds of millions across Africa. That this continent has come too far to keep waiting for others to decide its destiny. And if Africa wants to escape the endless cycle of repeating instability, the solution will not be found in international promises written in unfamiliar language. It will be found in the hands of the people living on this vast land. For decades, whenever West Africa fell into crisis, the world called in international organizations, peacekeeping forces, and imported security governance models. They arrived, they set up bases, they held conferences, they produced reports hundreds of pages thick. But when they left, what remained was often only numbers that spoke of failure. Because no organization can understand the Sahel better than the people who grew up inside its sandstorms. No power can love the stability of Burkina Faso, Mali, or Niger more than the citizens paying for it with their own lives. Africa's answer cannot come from outside. It must begin with self-recognition that this continent is no longer a dependent land. What AES has done in recent years, especially under young leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, is the clearest proof. They do not wait for signals from Paris, Brussels, or Washington. They build their own defense forces. They make their own strategic decisions. They protect their own skies. And most importantly, they force the world to respect those decisions. This does not mean Africa must close itself off or fight everyone. What Africa needs is the power to choose. Choose partners. Choose a development model. Choose a security system that fits. Not choices made under pressure or fear, but choices made for the real benefit of the people. When the C-130 incident happened, AES responded in a way that showed they no longer accept a lower seat at the political table. They know that if they do not stand up to defend sovereignty today, tomorrow there will be nothing left to tell the next generation. But this answer is not only in the hands of governments. It also lives in the continent's wider change. A young person in Ouagadougou wants a future not shaped by the fear of war. A farmer in Niger wants a child educated in schools built by their own nation. A mother in Bamako wants Mali's youth to grow up with pride, not shame. When those dreams meet, they form the foundation of an Africa that holds the key to its own future. That future begins with awakening, with understanding that borders drawn by others cannot decide a people's potential, with realizing that the world will always act for its own interests. And Africa must do the same for itself. If this continent wants a new chapter, this is the moment. Not through gunfire, not through blind confrontation, but through steady determination. Africa must be the one turning the key to open the door of the future. Not standing outside waiting for someone else to open it. There are lands the world is used to looking at with pity. The Sahara is one of them. People see only burning sand, poverty, a desert stretched out like a wound that never heals. But beneath that sand, something is moving. A quiet but powerful force is pushing the whole continent to look at itself again. And the C-130 being forced to land was only a signal. A reminder that the era of Africa standing at the edge of history is reaching its end. Africa will not rise from international conferences. It will not rise from neatly packaged aid. Africa rises when the people who stayed silent begin to speak. When nations once dismissed as weak declare they deserve respect. When countries like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger decide they will not sit and wait for others to define stability and progress. This rise does not come from comfort. It comes from endurance that has reached its limit. For years, the world spoke of the Sahel as a forgotten place. Yet that forgotten place is becoming the center of an awakening. Not an awakening of bullets, but of thinking. Not an awakening of loud slogans, but of firm choices. When AES declared it would protect every inch of its sky, it was not only defending airspace, it was defending dignity, defending the right to decide the future without asking permission, defending what their ancestors paid for in blood, and what later generations lost through unequal treaties. Africa will rise from the Sahara not because this land is rich in resources, but because it is rich in will. Rich in people who understand no one is coming to save them if they do not stand up first. Rich in youth brave enough to question models that have lasted too long. Rich in young leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, who understands weakness is not about the size of territory, but about the lack of courage to say no at the right moment. And when a continent begins to say no, the world is forced to change its gaze, forced to learn dialogue instead of control, forced to respect instead of command, forced to understand Africa is no longer soft ground for old strategies. This is a new continent, where even those once most disrespected are now standing tall in the wind. Africa's future will not be handed over. It will be built, decision by decision, choice by choice, brave action by brave action. Like Burkina Faso standing firm against that C-130. And even though the road ahead is still filled with trials, the torch lit in the Sahel is brighter than it has been at any moment in this century. The Sahara will no longer be only a symbol of harshness. It will become a symbol of rebirth. Because from the place where life seems impossible, the strongest seeds sometimes grow. And this time, that seed is the will of an entire continent rising to reclaim its name on the world's map. If you have stayed with this story until this moment, it means something has moved inside you. Not because an aircraft was forced to land. Not because diplomatic statements were read on camera. But because you realize what is happening in the Sahel is not only about Burkina Faso or Nigeria. It is about a past that was split apart. A present full of pressure. And a future that is demanding your voice too. Africa stands before the most important choice in decades. Not a choice between war and peace, but between awakening and sleep. If Africa does not tell its own story, someone else will tell it for them, in the way they want. If Africa does not define its own future, that future will be defined by forces that never truly understood this land. And if people like you do not speak, do not learn, do not follow these shifts with clear eyes, the continent will keep getting pulled into storms it did not create. That is why we make content like this. Not to create fear, not to assign blame, but to open a space where each person can face the truth and ask where they stand in Africa's larger picture today. Change never begins with a faceless crowd. It always begins with one individual who knows silence is no longer an option. If you believe sovereignty matters, if you believe this continent deserves its own voice, if you want to be part of the generation writing Africa's story with its own pen, leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is happening. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss a single story shaping Africa's destiny.